Greetings. Good evening. I'm Reverend Jeff Snyder, and this is Beyond Loaves and Fishes, the live stream Bible study. I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad that you are taking time out of your busy schedules to join us in this live stream Bible study tonight. Or if you're checking in with us later, we're really glad that you've come by, that you're interested in this form of study, and we hope you will join us live in the future. All you have to do is go to the J.S. Brooks channel on YouTube and hit the subscribe button. If you hit the little bell, you'll also be alerted to when our next live stream will be. Now, tonight we are really getting into the book of Ruth. And this is a much-loved book of the Bible. It's one of the favorites for many people. I was just having a talk with someone for whom it is an absolutely favorite book. So, we're going to start here in just a minute. I'm going to give you a little time for people to join us here on the live stream. But we'll only wait just a little while. And then we'll go ahead and begin. And I'm sure people will catch up as we move along. So, welcome. It's going to be a little weird tonight because it's exciting around here because this is Tech Week for Madeline. Hi, Melissa. It's good to have you with us. This is Tech Week for Madeline. In fact, this is the dress rehearsal night. She's got a play that opens on Friday, and Sherry's been doing some costume design for them. So everybody's out of the house but me and our 16-year-old beagle, Daisy. Who knows what will happen in the next half hour. Hopefully, Daisy will settle down and sleep in her bed and won't decide to bellow outside the door. But we'll see. You never know. That's what makes these Bible studies so very interesting, besides the topic of conversation. You don't know what's going to happen next. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'm glad you're with us, Melissa. I'm hoping we'll see a few more people in a minute or two. But let's go on. We're going to study Ruth. And in life today, as in Ruth's day, unexpected events take us by surprise and leave us questioning a great many things, like our own self-worth. Wondering if we have faith enough. Now, why did this thing happen to us? That why question, actually one of the most unanswerable questions of all times in many regards, unless you're dealing with something mechanical, especially but when you're dealing with life, why is very difficult to answer in a lot of cases. But, so, we ponder, was I not faithful enough? We wonder about the best decisions we can make in relationship with our own faith values. And we'll see that Ruth, hey Cheney, glad you're here. Joe and Anaya, I hope you're all there right now. It's good to hear from you. And so we end up asking from time to time, who is God, and does God care for me with what's going on in my life? Does God care about the lack of justice that's in my life, or the lack of justice in the world when something goes wrong? Hey, Julius, glad you're with us tonight. We reach difficult crossroads, and we find ourselves reassessing our beliefs about our religion, about our culture, about relationships, about how life works. And in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing when we have to do that periodic reassessment. We sometimes wonder, why can't life just be perfect and easy and wonderful? Well, if it was, we'd never have a chance to do any of this kind of reassessment. And that could be an absolute disaster from time to time. I'm fiddling with my screen. That's why you see things wiggling around a little bit. Fortunately, it didn't get anything moved too badly. So we ask these questions. Basically, it gets us to question everything that we assume in a matter-of-fact way is just part of regular life when things are rosy. We have to reevaluate. And this is what's happening in the book of Ruth. Is this a good thing? Well, I've already given my response to that, but what do you think? I'm glad. Well, be careful with your driving there, Julius. I hope I won't be distracting you from the road. So we're going to meet the main characters of the book of Ruth, and they have arrived at one such crossroads in chapter 1. And the human character of sin In Ruth, it reveals the limitations of the religious and cultural systems to help us rethink and to experience God. Some questions that Ruth posed for us include, will I allow myself to lean forward into God's generosity and towards other people with an open heart and open hands in fearful times, times like these? Am I going to be generous to other people? Am I going to help them out, or am I just going to try to take care of number one? Now, that's a burning question for anybody in any age. Will I be a faithful witness to God's unconditional, unbounded, and compassionate love? Or will I withdraw into myself and show a lack of faith in God's providence? Ruth is probably the most loved story, or one of the most loved stories, in all of the biblical canon of the Old and New Testament. There's a dialogue in it that helps us hear a woman's perspective, which is hard to come by in a patriarchal society and amongst the authors. Hey, Will, glad you're here. Among the authors of the Old and the New Testament. But here you have it. This is some insights and some glimpse into a world we don't often see a lot about. Some scholars conclude that the very existence of Ruth reveals that women had a powerful authority when it came to issues of everyday life that often went around the male-dominated society of their day, what they would call the patriarchal social structure. Ruth stands out among the biblical literature because it shows God's message to the Jews might come directly through women. And a great deal of inspiration could come through women. And that women were capable of critical thinking about faith and about their lives and about how to control their lives, which wasn't something you were commonly hearing back in the day. Not when people were, in many ways, trying to suppress women and make them under male authority. So, laws were trying to limit their power and their worth, but the story of Ruth goes against that. Ruth begins with Naomi's story. Naomi's a Hebrew woman from Bethlehem, and she becomes a poverty-stricken refugee in Moab. And this is the most despised. It's a shocking thing for the hearers of the story because Moab was the most despised of all the foreign lands for the Israelites. And while she's there, she's going to lose her husband and her sons, and subsequently loses one of her daughters-in-law due to religious purity laws and certain economic systems. This is a very clever story. It packs in a lot with its telling. In fact, it tells things well in what you would call a storytelling tradition. You have a lot of wordplay with the names and the characters, and it reveals what the first hearers of the story would have recognized is more than meets the average eye. It's certainly more than meets the modern eye and ear if you're not understanding the rules of life back in that day. So, much like the sermon from Sunday, where you had to understand certain rules for Jesus' instruction about turning the other cheek to make a lot of sense. But once you understand them, you have a real aha moment there. And so we're going to see some of that here in the book of Ruth. Now, Bethlehem, here's one of those plays on names right now. The age of the judges is not a really good age for Israel. Israel's wandering and straying from God. And Samson, who doesn't really follow the law, will become one of the best of the judges, and that's not saying much for the judges. But Bethlehem in this time, the name is clever play on words here because it means house of bread. And since the story begins with a famine, there is no bread in the house of bread. So you have a little bit of wordplay going on there. The husband's name, Elimelech, means my God is king, implies a great deal of faithfulness. But for survival, our faithful Jew takes his family among the Moabites, whom the Torah condemns as Lot's incestuous descendants. It's easier to read than say that sometimes. You can check that out in Genesis 19, verses 30 through 38 if you're interested. Naomi's name means sweetness. Her sons' names, Mahlon and Chilion, mean sickness or sick or diseased. So you can tell things might not go so well for them just because of their names. The sons marry Moabite wives named Orpah, which means nape of the neck, which implies she's prone to abandon. Now, I don't know why nape of the neck means you're prone to abandon. I didn't dig into that. I'll have to go back and look a little closer. But apparently that's how people understood it back in the day. And Ruth means watering to saturation, and implying that she's prone to generosity if she lives up to her name. And the names provide you with some foreshadowing. So if you were listening to this for the first time and you heard these names, you'd go, aha, I've got some idea what these people are going to be like and what I might expect from them. Just as in modern days you would know what to expect if somebody told you that Darth Vader was coming. That would tell you a particular thing. So, the first readers, they would see that we have a religious argument going on here. You've got this intermingling with foreigners, which would be disturbing to them, especially Moabites. This was considered to be an unfaithful act against God, and by law could easily lead to the death of a person so involved. You know, lots of death, lots of sorrow might be coming your direction, sort of a Shakespearean tragedy about to unfold. And sweet Naomi ends up suffering the consequences of her husband and her son's sins as she's taken along on this journey where she doesn't have a whole lot of say as to where they're going to go. The men have made that decision and off they've gone. So Orpah's name reminds the first reader that Moab's historical oppression to Israel. It reminds them of this from Judges 3:12 through 15, and foreshadows her abandonment of Naomi. But I think abandonment's an awfully harsh term, and you'll see that when we get into the first reading tonight. That's not entirely fair to her, but we'll see that as this story unfolds. At least I don't think so. We'll see what you think. The story assigns the name Ruth to a Moabite woman, and this goes against stereotype because Moabite women were rumored to be very promiscuous. And this would catch the first hearers off guard. This would have caused them a little confusion. And the Bible tends to do that. It sets you up with your own stereotypes, what you think you're going to be comfortable with, and then switches it up on you, just as Jesus did with the Good Samaritan. Those words just didn't make sense to the original hearers. But we have the prevailing religious and cultural norms on how God would relate to foreigners, and the desire for Jews and foreigners to be in relationship bursts this wide open. And you have to start thinking about it. You have to have some scrutiny here. The first readers and hearers are seeing their own stories of friends and families who have foreign kinship reflected in Ruth and Naomi's story, where they might be feeling a little defensive about a story like this, but then they can say, hey, look, there's good coming out of a story about intermarriage with foreigners. That's a relief to me and my family that makes me start rooting for Ruth. Do you know anybody who has been through something similar, where they've maybe gone to live in another land, they've come home with a spouse that's of another tradition or of another nation, and maybe that's caused some tension or dissonance back home? Maybe it's thrown people's stereotypes out of kilter? That would be interesting to hear those tales at some point. If you've got anything to say about that, chime on in. Naomi will become desperate to return home at one point, back to Bethlehem, back towards to the house of bread, because she senses that she might have some economic security there amongst her relatives. It's a thin hope. It's tricky. We'll get into it. But it's hope nonetheless, and people tend to grasp at straws when they're desperate. Have you ever felt that way, where you would leap at the smallest shred of hope in a difficult situation and go ahead and jump into it, even if common sense said that might not be the best thing to do? Has that ever happened to any of you? Naomi's sweetness is visible because she also desires security for her daughters-in-law, and will instruct them to return to the households of their mothers. Okay, we've set the scene. We've got a little background. We've done a little spade work there. And now we can actually start to read a little bit of Ruth and see what we've been talking about. So if you want to follow along in your Bible, we're reading Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. He and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Those took Moabite wives. It's getting more and more shocking. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now you can see a bit of the setup here. Now that's only into verse 5, and right now the story is sort of catering to people's biases and prejudices a little bit, saying, aha, they went to live in this foreign land, even though they were starving to death in their own. They went to live in Moab, which we really don't like, even though they had food there. And look what's happened. Dad, husband, father, and both sons are now dead. Well, now, isn't that what they deserve? Living 10 years in that foreign land. Shocking. So, thank you, Julius. That's really interesting to know. Both of them from different cultures, different tribes. Yeah, I can see that could cause all sorts of interesting relationships. So now moving on into this. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. How miserable to get to that point, to start to go back with that thread of hope, and then realize that you probably ought to send your daughters-in-law away. And this is the position that they're in. It's got to be a shock for all 3 women involved. And when they call Naomi mother, we have a recognition that she plays a pivotal role in the household decisions, including in marriages. So this is not total victim in this case. She does have a sense of authority going on here. But in the first chapter of Ruth, we reveal that there's a power with these repressed women in a male-dominated society. They are making decisions on their own. They're making decisions based on cultural and economic realities of life, along with religious realities. So they are grappling with deep issues and cultures that are prejudiced to think that this couldn't be possible. And it's being shown to be quite possible here. Have you ever seen this reading in this particular light? Have you ever seen it in this way? And there's an emotional exchange between Naomi and her two daughters-in-law that is heartbreaking. Let's get into that. We're in Ruth chapter 1, verses 9 through 18. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am old. I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. It has been far more bitter for you than for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus, and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. This is heartbreaking. This is so powerful. Have you ever seen a tearful farewell like this? Have you ever witnessed such a thing going on at an airport or a train station or at the bus, where people are splitting or leaving each other? Somebody's going somewhere and it's an uncertain thing when they'll see each other next. These kind of farewells still go on. There's an interesting sidebar here. Sages declare that Ruth's speech to Naomi reflected a conversation that certain parts were offering answers to specific statements made by Naomi. But Naomi's part of the conversation, unfortunately, wasn't included in the scriptures. It's been lost over the sands of time. It's been lost to us. And this is not surprising because we're dealing with ancient texts here. There's these books of the Bible range so far back in time. Most things don't survive that long. And they go all the way back to the beginnings of the Hebrew civilization, back when they were pastoral people, wandering people. And so this is coming from very early. So it's not surprising that pieces might have been lost or be missing or left out intentionally even. So, for example, when Ruth said she would go with Naomi, her mother-in-law responded that Jewish women didn't go to the theater and to circuses. Well, now that's an interesting thought right there. Makes you wonder, do you ever think of the people of Moab going to the theater or to the circuses? Do you ever think of that, people around Israel were doing the same in this period of time? It's not something we think of a lot. We might think of that in the Roman Empire, the bread and circuses idea. But just imagine this. And sure, theaters have been found in a great many places. So Ruth responds that she'd simply follow Naomi's example. Wherever you go, I will go. Imagine the level of faith that would take to do a thing like that. Then Naomi told her that she couldn't live in a house that didn't have a mezuzah on the door. Ruth replies, Wherever you live, I will live. When Ruth said, "Your people will be my people," she was saying, "I leave all idolatry behind. I leave the ways of my people behind to be one with you and your people." What a sacrifice. Giving up all the familiar, all that you grew up with, all that you knew, to follow your mother-in-law to a land you've never been to, but where you probably know full well they don't think much of you. It's shocking. It's quite the sacrifice. And she ends with, "Your God will be my God." Ruth is expressing her dependence on the God of Israel alone. And many would say that this is a greater level of faith than many of the people of Israel were showing at that time. Some would argue it's a great deal more faith than Naomi's husband and sons showed when they left Israel to go to Moab. So, this Jewish mother-in-law, she loves her Moabite daughters-in-law. Naomi's advice to return home, while it seems initially kind of cruel, especially as they're starting on their way, it's actually quite sensible. It is good advice, even if it's quite painful. Because their best hope was to place themselves at the mercies of their families, instead of staying with this penniless widow. It was practicality over love, because in the society they were living, an unmarried woman had very little power and very little chance of thriving in society without a husband. And Orpah, she abides by the religious and economic institutions of her day when she leaves Naomi, but she leaves her under great duress. There's a lot of weeping. She doesn't want to go. So this is why that term abandon bridled with me, because it doesn't look like abandonment. It looks like she's leaving quite reluctantly. So it seems unfair to use that term. It's a pretty reluctant and tearful and unhappy farewell. Also, the story is challenging us to take a stand in difficult situations and not to be swayed by even the most practical of arguments at times when we feel strongly about a thing. Ruth's decision to remain with Naomi is countercultural. It's unexpected. It's not what people expected others to do. It certainly wouldn't be expected of somebody from a suspect nation like Moab. It went against people's prejudices at the time. Her pledge is similar to Abraham's pledge to God when he left his home to follow God. So you've got some interesting parallels there. Ruth is behaving as a pious and faithful person whose ethics are guided by belief that my God is king, which is Elimelech's name, if you'll remember. Her actions demonstrate that she is an excessively kind person and very loving towards Naomi. She's willing to sacrifice a more certain future for a very uncertain one to follow Naomi back into the land of Israel, back to Bethlehem. She lives up to her name, watering to saturation. This is a great act of generosity on her part. So, and at this point, okay, that's a good question, Cheney. Why do they need to... I'm just trying to understand the details here. Okay, you've got two Moabite women who have married into an Israeli family who have come and lived in Moab. They're being treated well in Moab, even though they've had a great deal of lack of generosity. But the reason that you're they married. I'm assuming they married for love. The sons and daughters of the two different families married because they were actually attracted to each other. I don't think there was any suggestion that there was anything forced in this. But one of the reasons to marry for a single woman was to have some security that she couldn't have outside of her own family. When she came of a certain age, you married to gain the protection of a husband in a totally patriarchal society. There was very little chance after her husband dies. Oh, why couldn't Naomi marry? Naomi was beyond childbearing age, and this would make her not an attractive person to marry, according to the times that they were living in. She felt that she had reached an age where there was very little chance that she could marry at all. There was very little reason for a further member of her family to marry her. For instance, her husband's brother would be given that role if it would continue the family line. And the only way it would continue the family line is if she could then get pregnant and have children that would continue her husband's name. But that's not possible because Naomi is beyond that age. So there was very little reason under the law of Israel for her to be married to someone, or for someone to marry her, which meant that she had reached a position where she did have a very limited future. She could hope that some part of her family would take her in out of generosity, but basically her future was dim by the standards of her day. And so she's trying to send her daughters-in-law home where they might, because they were young enough to have children, and by her standards, the standards of the people of Israel, that was where they would have the best opportunity to have a future that included a family and protection for them. It's a complicated system, but that's basically what they were dealing with. I hope that gives you some sense of what's going on, and we're going to get into that a little further, but we're going to do that next time because we're now running past our time limit, and I don't want to keep you. I want to honor our time limits, and we'll pick this up next week with Ruth chapter 1, 19 through 22, if you want to read ahead. So Ruth wants to marry. You're getting ahead of the story here, there, Cheney. Yeah, Ruth actually wants to marry Boaz in a way to protect Naomi, as not only to protect herself, but to protect Naomi, and we'll get into that. It's part of her very generous nature, and it's part, again, of what would very much surprise the hearers of a story, because, after all, she's a Moabite, but she is actually being very faithful to God and very faithful to this family that she's married into. And that's where marrying Boaz will become so pivotal for her. And we'll get into that very directly next week, along with some pretty interesting shading in scholarship that I think is going to be fun for us to explore. But for now, let's go ahead and call it a night. And I don't want to push my limits with the dog either so far. I think she's sleeping in her bed, but she could get up and start barking at any time. So I'd better wrap this up and go. This is a wonderful story. I like it too. I've read it a number of times, and I'm glad to come back to it. After this, this won't take very long. It's kind of refreshing after Matthew. So we might head into Judges, which is all part of this, right after this, because it's all part of the same story. And I think it would be interesting to dig a little deeper into the history of Israel at this particular period of time. But for now, let's go ahead and pray, and I'll let you get on with your evenings. I thank you again for coming. It's really a delight every time we get to do this. I enjoy it a great deal, and I hope you do as well. So let's pray together. Dear God, we thank you for this opportunity to come together. We thank you for the chance to put aside the other things in our lives so that we can spend some time with you and with your word, and to be challenged by what you have to tell us in the text and the questions that you raise in our minds that we have to deal with. Thank you for all of that. Thank you for these great words that have come down to us from so far in the past, these amazing stories and all they have to tell us. Be with us now as we go from this place. Help us to make wise decisions, faithful decisions, and to bring you greater glory in all that we say and do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you for coming. Good night to you all. I look forward to seeing you here again next week. And in the meantime, I hope to see you all on Sunday. I hope the storms didn't cause you any trouble that we had, or all that wind that we've had over the past couple of days. I'm thanking God that an old tree in our property is still standing upright. So I will see you again next week. God bless you all, and good night. Have a blessed evening. So